Hello again. I am Rebecca Dorch, the Senior Spectrum Policy Analyst at the Institute for Telecommunication Sciences, ITS, which is the research lab of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA. This video is the conclusion to the first series of short tutorial videos for the 2022 International Symposium on Advanced Radio Technologies, ISART, whose topic is on evolving spectrum sharing regulation through data, science, and technology-driven analysis and decision-making. ISART is a U.S. government-sponsored conference hosted by the Institute for Telecommunication Sciences in Boulder, Colorado since 1998. The first series of tutorials focused on the current U.S. regulatory process to establish spectrum sharing. This concluding tutorial in that series uses the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, CBRS, as a case study showing how the different aspects of the spectrum sharing regulatory process actually work in a specific spectrum sharing scenario, and how NTIA, the FCC, the Department of Defense, and industry all worked collaboratively together to create a successful framework for spectrum sharing between incumbent DoD radars already operating in the band and performing mission-critical operations, and commercial incumbents also operating in the band and providing satellite services and terrestrial wireless services, while enabling new licensed and unlicensed entrants into the band to provide innovative new services and 5G. This CBRS case study starts by looking at the vision for CBRS. The process was explained by Peter Tenhula in the tutorial on spectrum repurposing and sharing drivers and authorities. Next, the case study looks at technical research and feasibility analyses conducted to inform development of the rules for this new service. The process explained in Ed Rosella's tutorial on NTIA's feasibility analysis. With CBRS, research on technical aspects of sharing the band continued throughout the rulemaking process, with critical technical input submitted into the rulemaking process at the FCC by NTIA, along with thousands of pages of comments from hundreds of interested parties, a process explained by Suzanne Tatro in a tutorial on the FCC's rulemaking process. Then we'll look at implementation of the new rules, from development of standards to testing and auctions and licensing. The Tuesday keynote by Evan Carell looks at auctions, and a panel on Wednesday will discuss standards development using propagation as a case study. Finally, this case study touches on monitoring and reporting on the CBRS sharing framework post-deployment. And in the next series of tutorials on lessons learned from spectrum sharing, Andy Clegg shares lessons learned from CBRS. The origins of CBRS can be traced back to at least 2010, and then President Obama's presidential memorandum requiring that the federal government make available 500 megahertz of federal and non-federal spectrum for both mobile and fixed wireless broadband use by commercial users within 10 years, i.e. by 2020. NTIA's October 2010 Fast Track report identified the 3.5 gigahertz band as a candidate for spectrum sharing in response to the president's initiative, but found that the need to preserve essential federal services meant that the spectrum from 3550 to 3650 megahertz could only be offered with very large exclusion zones extending inland nearly 200 miles from both the east and the west coast of the United States, and thereby excluding a majority of the U.S. population. In 2010, 2011, and 2012, ITS hosted ISART symposiums, where the spectrum stakeholder community gathered in Boulder to discuss technologies and science-based ways to achieve the spectrum sharing goalposts set out by the Obama administration. The focus of the ISART program in 2011 to demystify radar technologies and understand radar's use of the spectrum actually helped provide the technical foundations for developing the regulatory paradigm for radar and commercial sharing in the 3.5 gigahertz band, leading eventually to CBRS. The 2012 report from the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, often referred to as the PCAST report, made numerous recommendations, including to expand access to the 3550 to 3650 megahertz radar band for commercial operations and make it an innovation band. The FCC subsequently proposed in December of 2012 to make 100 megahertz of shared spectrum available in the 3.5 gigahertz band using small cell and database technologies. This midband spectrum, used by military radars off the coasts and at inland radar test and development sites and at ports, was a candidate for sharing with commercial, terrestrial LTE type technology. NTIA, through ITS and the Office of Spectrum Management, OSM, conducted numerous technical studies on radar and sharing between radars and terrestrial mobile technologies, publishing the results to help everyone understand the technical issues that would need to be addressed to share the 3.5 gigahertz band and have effective coexistence between these very different types of technologies. In 2014, the FCC then issued a further notice of proposed rulemaking, proposing rules to make up to 150 megahertz of spectrum available for a new innovation band, as originally described in the PCAST report. For the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, the FCC proposed innovative new rules to promote intensive shared use of the spectrum. Specifically, the FCC proposed a 3-tier sharing framework. Incumbents, both federal and commercial, would be protected from interference from all lower-tiered new entrants. Second-tier priority access new entrants would be protected from interference from the third-tier general access unlicensed new entrants. In light of the 2010 Fast Track report from NTIA, the FCC proposed exclusion zones to protect the federal incumbents, noting plans for NTIA and the FCC to work together to assess exclusion zones in light of the new technologies and new data from technical studies and evaluations of coexistence between radars and wireless broadband services. NTIA's ITS and OSM continue to conduct and publish the results from numerous technical studies on radar and on sharing between radars and terrestrial mobile technology. The NTIA, FCC, DoD, and industry stakeholders all worked on technical plans and solutions to reduce the impact of the exclusion zones while protecting critical federal systems. During this time, industry and associations and academics and interested parties all filed thousands of pages of comments and reply comments and ex parte letters in the FCC's docket for CBRS. The FCC's website shows that ultimately, over 878 filings were received in this docket alone. NTIA's further engineering analysis shared with the FCC found that the exclusion zones described in the Fast Track report could be reduced by 77% with microcell deployments in consideration of clutter. NTIA also recommended employing some of the solutions recommended by commenters in the docket, such as employing sensing technologies to essentially convert exclusion zones to protection zones, and employing a phased implementation and approval process for the spectrum access systems and sensing capabilities. The significant amount of early technical research conducted and analysis performed to assess the feasibility and viability of sharing spectrum in the 3.5 gigahertz band by both NTIA and industry aided formulation of technical rules for sharing contained in the report and order the FCC adopted in 2015 to make 150 megahertz of spectrum at 3550 to 3700 megahertz available for wireless broadband and other innovative uses. Incorporating the views and information collected through 3 rounds of notice and comments and workshops, the first report and order adopted the 3-tiered framework to coordinate shared federal and non-federal use of the band, enabled by a spectrum access system or SAS and environmental sensing capability sensors (ESCs), and then adopted a hybrid framework for licensed and unlicensed opportunistic access to the spectrum by new entrants to enable local supply and demand to determine the best approach. As noted in the tutorial on the rulemaking process, the FCC did receive petitions for reconsideration, which they addressed in the 2016 second report and order on reconsideration, to then finalize the CBRS rules in 47 CFR Part 96. With the rules now final, it was time for the implementation stage, starting with the development by industry of standards and equipment, continuing research by NTIA and industry to refine the rules to maximize effective utilization of the shared spectrum, and revisions of the rules by the FCC. One interesting thing the FCC did in this rulemaking was to encourage an industry-led multi-stakeholder group to focus on the complex technical issues and develop innovative solutions, technical specifications and standards, and accreditation programs. The Wireless Innovation Forum, WIN Forum, Spectrum Sharing Committee, an industry-led multi-stakeholder standards group did just that, standing up committees to begin developing communications protocols and technical specifications for CBSD devices and spectrum access system operations, requirements for cybersecurity and operational security, and recommendations for test and certification processes and plans. NTIA, through ITS and OSM, continued to perform research, releasing official eHATA propagation code in GitHub for use by SASs, publishing technical reports related to developing parameters for and testing of environmental sensing capability sensors, and developing, in close collaboration with DoD, the FCC, and input from the multi-stakeholder group, dynamic protection areas, DPAs, for use with ESCs to enable protection of the DoD radar systems while providing greater flexibility and deployment areas for commercial operations, which were adopted by the FCC in May of 2018. WinForm technical specifications for CBRS operations by SASs and CBSDs were relatively well settled by October of 2018, and SAS testing specs and code were relatively settled by December of 2018. Also in October of 2018, the FCC updated the licensing and technical rules for priority access licensees, PALs, changing from census tracts to counties, with licenses to be assigned by competitive bidding. The SAS systems, ESC sensors, and CBSD equipment all went through rigorous testing prior to the FCC certifying any of the components for operation. Bench and lab conformance and certification testing of the new spectrum access systems and environmental sensing capability sensors were conducted by ITS under cooperative research and development agreements with the FCC conditionally certified SAS administrators and ESC operators. Field testing, analysis, and reporting on the SAS systems occurred through the FCC's initial commercial deployment testing. Analysis of the ESC's coverage of dynamic protection areas was performed by NTIA's Office of Spectrum Management. And also in 2019, the FCC was gearing up for auctioning the priority access licenses, which occurred in the third quarter of calendar year 2020, raising $4.58 billion. Even with all of this going on, NTIA, the FCC, Department of Defense, and Cbrs stakeholders continue to research ways to improve commercial access to the band, particularly around ports and inland sites with ground-based radars. Today, Cbrs is deployed and growing. The regulators are monitoring the sharing framework, and so far, it appears that all of the scientific research, carefully crafted technical rules, detailed standards, and rigorous testing paid off, and the framework does indeed appear to be working well.